I'm happy to introduce Kim Daniels, who works now at the Georgetown University Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. So Kim is a graduate of Princeton University and University of Chicago Law School, and was appointed by Pope Francis as a member of the Vatican Dicastery for Communication in 2016. She's been a lead advisor to the U.S. bishops and Catholic organizations on issues where church teachings intersect with public life, including immigration, human life and dignity, religious liberty, and care for creation. And she and her husband have 6 children. If you know Kim at all, you know she's exceedingly bright and warm and so generous to spend some of her very busy schedule with us this afternoon. So just really looking forward to hearing what she has to say. So again, without anything else getting in our way here, I'll throw it over to you, Kim.
Thanks, Mike. That was so nice. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me here today. And excuse my voice. I'm just getting over a cold. I feel like I sound like a chain smoker here. So apologize about that. I just want to give you a quick sense of my background as we get started here, and what I bring to this issue, my reasons for engagement with it. I'm a background as a religious liberty attorney, but I have been working with church institutions and involved in significant conversations on this from both a personal and professional level for this year, certainly professionally. Personally, very close to my family in many ways. My brother's high school principal, a priest that was close to our family, all have serious allegations of abuse against them. I think that anyone, all of us who are in the Catholic Church here in the U.S. know that this touches all of us in some way very personally. Professionally, here at the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life, what we try to do is bring Catholic principles to the public conversation. And we mostly work around central mission issues. So human life and dignity, poverty, the environment, immigration, religious liberty, and others. We felt like we couldn't talk about those issues with any credibility if we didn't first talk about the elephant in the room, which was the clergy abuse crisis. And so at the beginning of the year, we began a series of events around this. We had 3 large events in the fall, one for young people, one for the entire Georgetown and DC community, where we filled Gaston Hall with DC Catholics, some 600 people, I believe. And then a third in Dahlgren Chapel, where we really tried to make it more of a conversation centered around prayer and reflection. In the spring, we've done internal work here at Georgetown. We've had a lecture series. We've had a sort of conversation with Father Hans Zollner, who was one of the organizers of the February meeting on abuse of minors in the church. And we have had a conference with the law school and upcoming national leadership convening on this. So really, it's been crucial to our work. And personally, for me, in my role at the Vatican Dicastery for Communication and in other connections over there, I was an advisor to the organizing committee for the February meeting. And I learned a lot from that. And I hope to be able to talk a little bit about that as we move forward here, because it was a really good lesson for me as to how the church works and how we can bring, I think, voices that many of you would bring as well, just voices of common sense and real a desire to communicate effectively on this, so that because that's part of our mission here, is achieving transparency and achieving a kind of honesty about this issue, and that is crucial to success on this issue, to moving forward. Not that there's success, but to developing some kind of a path forward. I also want to say that of all of those events, I think that the one that was the most important to me was the first one we had this year, which was with young people, young professionals in DC. It was really exciting to listen to them in one sense. It was at the beginning of the year, right in the wake of Cardinal McCarrick's, Cardinal Wuerl, the Pennsylvania Grand Jury report. And again, we had a standing room only crowd. And what I was most interested in hearing was, number one, it was a new issue for them, right? They had not lived through 2002. They were children then. They had not lived through the 80s and the 90s and all of the issues that some of us have faced. And so it was very new in many ways, and they were very angry that church leaders would have helped allowed this to happen. I'm sure you all are seeing that anger where you are and that anguish. And at the same time, they were engaged with the church and hopeful. And so I was really glad to see that. And I think that puts the responsibility back on us who have roles in the church to say that it's on us to help carry this forward, to help make a path forward for young people who want to remain engaged with the church, but have given this kind of awful tragedy and are struggling with what to do with that. So with that, let's get to it. I want to first talk about, before we get to anything, we're talking here about communications and the crisis in the church. But I think that you'll see that we're going to talk a little bit about the fact that we have to root it in, we have to root this in our faith, and we have to root it in the gospel. And then we can't, Pope Francis in his letter to the U.S. bishops says something that I think it's important to keep central here, which is at the end of the day, this isn't about marketing or strategizing, but it's about the beating heart of the gospel. And we're in this crisis of credibility. And how do we regain that? We don't regain it by sort of a slick website or some fancy new way of talking about something, hitting just the right turn of phrase. We get that credibility by trust, and trust is born of daily acts of service. Sincere, daily, humble, and generous service to all is how he puts it, but especially those closest to the Lord's heart. And here, obviously, victim survivors are the closest to the Lord's heart in this awful tragedy. And so one of the great lessons that I know all of us working on this have learned is to keep their voices front and center. Let's move forward and give a little bit of a general overview of what we're going to talk about today. I think that before we get to these questions, let's think a little bit about where we are. I think it's always important to situate yourself in the context that you're working in. And I think it's hard to think of a subject that's more serious than this one, more in need of greater truth, greater love in discussion of it. It's been one of anger and anguish for the church in the U.S. in particular for decades now. And from a communications perspective, of course, it's hard to think of anything more challenging than to try to help shape a response here, and a response that helps move us forward towards justice, reform, renewal, and doesn't get in the way, and in fact serves the cause of accountability and transparency. In particular, it's hard because so many of the people we know, so many Catholics have been tempted to stay angry and to live in that anger and anguish, and with good reason. I mean, every week I feel like we see another shoe dropping, another story of someone not held accountable, another flesh and blood person who has suffered at the hands of someone connected with the church. And yet we know that we can't let this overpower us or overcome us, that we have to have some kind of a response here that helps move this forward from anger to justice and hope. And again, hope and with the grace of God. I mean, there's so much that we have to get done here. I think that lets us focus on three questions. How do we direct anger and anguish towards reform and renewal? I think that's central to our role as communications professionals. How do we effectively convey these efforts so as to begin to regain credibility and trust? So in dioceses around the country, in religious orders and other organizations around the country, people are working to try to come up with reform steps or efforts. How do we work to help convey those efforts and to convey what's happening and the reality of it? And at the same time, be truthful and honest about the challenges that lay ahead. And ultimately, how can effective communications help move us forward together? I think that it's really important to say that communications is an essential part of the problem. I mean, a central issue here has been a lack of honesty on the part of church leaders, an isolated and enclosed church culture, a lack of transparency. And so building up both the professionalization of communications around this issue and the openness and candor that people rightly expect around it, I think is just a central part of the solution. It's not merely something procedural off to the side. So let me talk about our focus today, and how we'll shape this conversation. I want to first talk about the church's crisis of credibility and how we begin to address it. I want to give a sense of how serious the credibility crisis is. Pope Francis has focused on it several times in major remarks, and I know it's one very close to his heart. And we can't communicate about our gospel mission. We can't communicate about the many important issues that we want to talk about and advocate on and serve without addressing this crisis of credibility. Secondly, I want to talk about some substantive spiritual and moral principles to ground our work. I think that we have to remember that we're, again, as we often say, we're not another NGO. We're here rooted in the gospel of Jesus Christ, and it's important to root our conversation in some spiritual and moral principles. Remember what we're doing and where we are and who we're serving. And finally, to get to some very nuts and bolts, practical, effective principles of effective communication in this current moment. So let's move forward. I want to talk a little bit before we get there, set the context. And that's how we got here. Let's have a sense about how we got here to this situation in 2018, where the audiences that we're trying to communicate to, whether it be Catholics in the pews, whether it be Catholics who attend Mass twice a year, whether it be non-Catholics, whether it be people around the globe, whether so many audiences, people who are rightly looking at the church and seeing it in a state of crisis and seeing it not responding with the kind of action and alacrity that we might expect. And so how do we get to this spot? I think I've written about this at Church Life Journal, but I want to briefly review what I think is the 4 waves. We can call it very simplified manner, obviously, the 4 waves of the crisis in the U.S. church. It first came to broad, of course, it's been going on for decades. And of course, there's, we have centuries, obviously, that we have no information about prior periods of time and the kind of abuse that occurred then, the abuse of power and the abuse of the vulnerable, including sexual abuse. But here in the U.S., in terms of public media attention, first really came to broad public attention in the 1980s. There was an awful case in Louisiana, Father Gilbert Bate, who abused some dozens of children. It was an awful story, and that brought national attention. Jason Berry brought that to light, and it drew some scattered diocesan responses, nothing really systematic at all. In the 1990s, it reemerged again, a number of different cases, most prominent probably the case of Father James Porter up in Fall River, Massachusetts. Again, a horrible case of many, many children being abused at the time. And this drew a little bit more of a robust response. Both the U.S. bishops and the Vatican developed more robust anti-abuse policies. Cardinal Bernardin in Chicago was a leader on this. And it was obviously a good step forward, but nowhere near where we needed to be. 2002, as you all know, the Boston Globe published their Spotlight series, some 800 articles in the Spotlight series. I think 150 priests were removed as a result of that. And obviously it drew wide national attention. We all know about the Oscar-winning movie. But also, of course, it drew the bishops to gather in June 2002 in Dallas and come up with the Charter for the Protection of Children and Young People, also known as the Dallas Charter. A number of different principles central to that. Bishops called on themselves to promote healing and reconciliation with victim survivors and their families, to promptly and effectively respond to claims of abuse, to cooperate with civil authorities, which is very important, discipline offenders and create a safe environment, and also to provide means of accountability for priests in the future. And that established things like the National Review Board and a secretariat at the USCCB to deal with this. Very importantly, in all of the things that I've just listed, you've noticed that the Dallas Charter obviously did not have a provision to keep bishops themselves accountable, to hold bishops themselves accountable. And that is when that's what got us here to 2018 and the 4th wave of the crisis, right? Now the crisis has reached the highest levels of the church, and the failure this time was largely caused by this failure to include bishops in the Dallas Charter, at least here in the US. So if 2002 was about the behavior of priests, 2018 is about accountability for bishops. We obviously, I'm sure I don't need to rehearse the events of this past year with you. We've had, obviously, McCarrick. We've had Cardinal Wuerl here in D.C., the Vigano letter in the fall, which threw all of these scattershot and tendentious allegations around. We had a November bishops meeting, which just conveyed ineffectiveness, frankly, in many ways. We've had the February meeting on the protection of minors recently. Most of all, to my mind, we've had a real evidence that this is a global crisis, right? We've seen it around the world, from Australia, Canada, Chile, Germany, India, Mexico, Ireland, France. I mean, I could go on. The crisis has arisen now, not just here in the US, but clearly on a global scale. I don't mean to say that it wasn't on a global scale before, but again, that it's now coming to public light in these countries. And of course, there are many countries where we don't know what's going on. We don't know how the church is handling abuse allegations, or if, in fact, it's something that's buried in shame in a way that prevents it from coming to public light. So I have to take a breath in a sense when I talk about all that, because it's such a tragic story. So many people look at that history. I feel like I ran through it very quickly, and I want to pause for a minute to give it a little bit more attention, and to make sure we focus on the decades that we've been trying to address this, and doing so ineffectively. And I think that you can understand where we are. First of all, you can understand the great frustration of people who have been directly affected by this, victim survivors, their families, the people who love them, people who work in the church, and who want to serve the church, and who are failing to get the leadership that we need. So many others. So I just want to pause for a moment and note that. I don't mean to sort of jump over all of that as if it's just a rehearsal of a set of facts or an abstraction, because of course it's not. And so for that reason, of course, it's resulted in a real crisis of credibility, a crisis of moral authority. It's hard for us as a church now to communicate well on issues like the death penalty, issues of advocacy for the unborn, standing up for immigrants, any of the number of mission issues that so many of our institutions work hard on. I want to put some numbers on that crisis of credibility to let you know how serious it is. Just this last January, Gallup did a poll. A record low 31% of U.S. Catholics rated their clergy's standards of honesty highly. So only a third of U.S. Catholics say that they can really trust and really uphold the honesty of our clergy. I think that's shocking. And this is a 18-point percentage drop in a year. So clearly moved by the events of the year. Their confidence in the church dropped between 2017, 2018 from 52% to 44%. And of course, this also comes after years of a steady decline in these numbers. So it's not like we're coming from a high place. These numbers were already declining. So here's where we are here now in 2018. I talked about a communications challenge before, and I can't think of anything that's more difficult than trying to talk about this honestly and in a way that moves us forward. And so before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the kind of spiritual and moral principles that need to underlie our response. As I do this, I don't want to distract from the need for concrete, solid changes in the way church law, in the way the church approaches this issue, and measures of accountability and transparency and all the rest. Clearly, those kinds of concrete responses are central to what we need to do here to be able to communicate effectively. I think the central communications principle is that substance drives communication. And so we need to have substantive, concrete action, substantive, concrete responses before we can communicate effectively. But having said that, again, we're here working in the church. We're here working for the gospel mission of our Lord Jesus Christ. And we have to root what we do in a spiritual place, in our moral principles. Pope Francis wrote this letter, the January 1st letter to the U.S. bishops, and it really centered around core themes of his pontificate. And I think it's a great place to start to kind of step behind these concrete responses and practical approaches that we'll talk about in a minute. He said in the letter, it's really worth revisiting if you can pull it up online or what have you, but it's really worth revisiting. I think it's very powerful. He talks, first of all, in very strong language about the abuse crisis. He talks about the sins and crimes committed by various clerics, including bishops. And he says most essentially that our changes, any changes we make in procedure, need to be rooted in a spiritual and pastoral conversion. When I was in Rome for 4 different trips this year surrounding this issue, and including about 10 days around the February meeting. And I have to say that this theme came through again and again from people who've worked on it for years, that regardless of what kind of policies you put on paper, what kind of changes you make in the law or in regulations or what have you, those written policies, those written standards don't come to life unless people own them, unless bishops own responsibility for the problem, unless they have that conversion of heart that's necessary. So again, this isn't all that we need to do, but it's a big part of what we need to do, converting hearts towards understanding that this is a central priority of the church. I know that that was one goal of that February meeting. I saw that happen among some. You could see leaders, Episcopal leaders and others come into the meeting and with this kind of dismissive attitude, frankly, about the issue. That this isn't a priority, that it only happens in Western countries, et cetera, and have a transformation of heart based on listening to the testimony of victim survivors. We're listening to the powerful words of people like Sister Veronica Openivo and others. So in any event, I think Pope Francis identifies this conversion as very central. I think that just as bishops and church leaders need to have this conversion of heart, I think we all need to focus on how we can put this front and center as well. Secondly, he talks about unity. And I think that another important principle here is not to let ideological agendas or ecclesial agendas distract from the central issue of what can we do right now to substantively improve the church's response on clergy sexual abuse issues. And so, in other words, we see, and I won't even get into it today because I do think it's a distraction from both the right and the left. You see people who have a preferred response to, say, describing the causes of the crisis or describing sort of broad general ideas about what we might do, as a church over the course of decades or centuries. To my mind, my lane is focusing very practically on what we can do now and in the next years. But also, I think not only is that just practical lane something important and useful, I think it's important, as Pope Francis says, to build unity in the church and to focus on not the issues that divide us, but where we can come together. That's so important for our witness here. But thirdly, he points out that again, this idea that it's not about marketing or strategizing, it's about the beating heart of the gospel. And another way he puts that is he says it's not flow charts. We don't want to think of ourselves as being in the evangelization business. I think often in communications we can fall prey to this, right? I mean, we're very excited about the great website or the great materials we've produced or what have you. And this letter is a useful reminder that those are all important, but at the end of the day, we build credibility from trust, and trust comes from sincere daily acts of service. We all know that the most powerful witnesses we know are people who do that day-to-day service, and that's where we need to focus as a church on where we are living out our gospel mission, and that's how we'll build up credibility again to be able to focus on that mission. And finally, I just want to say that another set of principles, obviously, that we should be able to think about in grounding our response here are just basic Catholic social teaching, right? Respecting human dignity, including the dignity of victim survivors. Living in solidarity. Another great line from this letter is that we're not solitary pilgrims, Pope Francis says. He says, we're not solitary pilgrims. If one member suffers, we all suffer together. And finally, the need for justice. I don't want to, cloud this idea that in any kind of happy talk, I mean, there's a real need for justice for people here, and that has to be kept front and center as well. Let's move forward and talk a little bit about some practical principles. I guess the place I feel like I learned a lot about how to approach this was in thinking about this February meeting. And that's a sort of another conversation, the results of that, and maybe we can talk about that in the question period. But in thinking about, we're bringing together, for anybody who doesn't know, when the Vatican in February 2019 brought together the presidents of Episcopal conferences from around the world to this important global summit over the course of, there's 4 days, 3 days really, and also leaders of religious orders and others. Victim survivors gave testimony each day, and there were some victim survivor groups there, which was sort of I don't want to say a parallel meeting. I want to say a part of this meeting. I wish it had been even more a part of the meeting, but in any event, that was where the church was having this discussion in February. And in thinking about how to prepare for that, These are the general principles that how to communicate, let's put it that way, on this meeting. Well, how should we talk about this? First we talked about keeping victim survivors front and center again. I think the organizers of the meeting wanted that to be a clear priority, and certainly we thought that it was central to how we could effectively communicate on this issue. Secondly, I think a focus on the global nature of the problem. That's what I learn and am reminded whenever I go to Rome, that here in the US, we're 6% of the world's Catholics. So while we are a very important church, we are a small part of the US, of the global church. And we bring an important perspective, and we bring many lessons learned, again, over decades. But at the same time, we have much to learn from people in other countries. And we also, as a church, are responsible for both bringing what we know and learning from others. And this meeting was largely about that kind of engagement as well. And finally, we focused on 3 themes. I think it's very important to the leaders, the organizers of the meeting, kind of wanted to make sure that we kept front and center 3 big ideas. And they were responsibility for bishops. This was something bishops needed to own and take accountability for. Secondly, holding bishops accountable. How can we establish procedures that hold bishops accountable for either abuse themselves or cover up of that abuse? And finally, transparency. And I've talked about that already. I think that's just central. That's where we as communicators have our greatest responsibility, is in pushing for increased transparency in the church. Other general principles, and these are more broad, are the importance of lay involvement here. And, as this is a central part of the ongoing conversation in the U.S. Church, the Catholic Partnership Summit happened here in D.C., I think January of this year, where the Leadership Roundtable brought together lay leaders from a number of, just from across the country, and a wide variety of organizations, to talk about what kind of steps can we take to improve the ability of lay people to be involved in the church, to make us more engaged, to take actual decision-making leadership roles. It was a very powerful conference with lots of good results. There's materials at their site if you want to take a look at it. And obviously, moving that step forward depends on action from the bishop's action from the Vatican. Very hopeful that we'll see something like that. And at the same time, it's something for us as lay people, those of you who are lay people, and others to advocate for. Because I know I brought, it was interesting to me to be one of the few lay people in some of these conversations. I think we bring an important perspective, whether it be as parents, whether it be from our professional roles, whether it just be from living in an environment that involves children and old people in a way that maybe sometimes clerics don't have the same, maybe are a little bit more isolated. Not always the case, but sometimes. So for me, lay involvement is a critical part of the solution here, and I think that for many others as well. Finally, reforming the clerical culture. In many ways, there's a clerical culture of isolation and abuse of power that allows abuse of power to occur. And I think that anybody who works in an environment in chanceries and dioceses, you see little aspects of this culture to greater and lesser degrees. But I think, again, the most important aspect of it that I note from where I sit is a lack of honesty and candor, a lack of trust of lay people and lay professionals who often bring great skills to these conversations. I simply think the culture of secrecy is one that doesn't advance the ball at all. And the best person, if you're interested in sort of pursuing this anymore, the best person who talked about this is a guy named, many of you may know, Russell Shaw, who was a great leader in the U.S. Church on communications. He was the director of communications for the USCCB years ago. He has a great book called Nothing to Hide: Secrecy, Communication, and Communion in the Church. And he says, I'm going to quote from him, I think it's a great book to talk about. He's someone who's very steeped in the hierarchy and in working with prelates and others. And he notes that secrecy makes accountability all but impossible. And he says, while Americans take it for granted that just as much as possible, all the rest of our public business affecting everyone should be carried on publicly, even in this day and age, we don't expect that of the church, and we should. It's not that, as he says, openness and candor would have prevented the scandal, but it would have made it a lot less traumatic than it turned out to be. And clearly we can hopefully expect that an honest and open church is the kind of church that God looks to us to have. So in any event, we can explore that further, but I do think that that's very important, and I really lean towards openness and honesty in communications wherever it's possible. Not that there's not times when obviously confidentiality is important, or whether it's important, to advance the ultimate goal of accountability or what have you, but those are the general disposition, in my view, should be towards more openness and more candor. Finally, I want to say, in any of these conversations, as communicators, I think it's important for us to recognize that the media has played an enormously valuable role in encouraging transparency and openness, and into bringing these cases to light. Too often, we heard about all of this from the media when we should have heard about it from our own leaders. And I think it's always good to hold that up. Not that there aren't irresponsible journalists, but it's really not our job so much to call that out as to recognize the responsible journalists who have helped bring this to light. So let's get into kind of the nuts and bolts practical steps. I want to say that, first of all, as I can't emphasize enough, that central to our role as communicators is to say that substance drives communication, and it's towards pushing the principles that we're working with to arrive at effective substantive responses. And while we might not be in a position to shape those substantive responses, where our lane might be communication, I think it's important to push the idea that that it's not about sort of repackaging or coming up with great language or phrases. That's all part and parcel of what repackaging isn't part and parcel, but sort of finding the right language to use with people is part of what we do. But it's not the important thing here. The important thing is the underlying substance. There is no magic wand. And we all can recognize that significant concrete steps are necessary right now still from our clerical leaders in the church. And so part of our role is really pushing that again and again and again. Second principle, as we try to craft effective communications, is to look at the media environment we face. I think you really have to understand, we all know the media environment you're in before you can act in response and try to be effective within it. I think that it's, right now, it won't surprise anyone to say that we live in an environment, is particularly a social media environment, that's hostile, that's divisive, it's tribal, it's toxic. It polarizes, it goes to the worst elements instead of looking for the best. It erodes trust, it amplifies crises, it undermines authority, it does everything that we don't need right now. And it's overwhelming and it's omnipresent. I mean, you can't look at a person walking on the street and not see them buried in their smartphone. We all have access to it at every moment of every day. And so in many ways, if you're looking and trying to understand your environment as a communicator in the church, you realize that it's like whispering in a hurricane at best, right? I mean, we're under-resourced. We have small vehicles for communicating, and we are facing just a tsunami of hostility and polarization in our media culture. And so the question is, what's our response, right? Do we retreat to the hills? That's one response that some people want to do. Do we just communicate with those who are like-minded? And that's another response that we see so frequently, right? People retreating into their bubbles, talking to people who already agree with them, and in fact, building up walls around them by encouraging each other in their preconceived notions. And then, of course, another response you often see is that people decide that, well, if we can't beat them, we'll join them and we'll be just as hostile as everybody else and just as polarizing and divisive. And there we won the Twitter argument of the day. And isn't that great? No, obviously it's not great. And it's certainly not a place where we should be as Catholics. Because once again, I think that we need to remember that we need to come at this from a posture of people called to live the gospel. And so I think that the best way we can respond is by following St. Francis de Sales and saying we need to be who we are and we need to be that well. We don't want to try to be, we want to look at somebody in the secular world who we think is very effective on social media, or we think is very effective at communicating on a difficult issue through hostility or through, snarkiness or whatever. That's not going to work for us, and it shouldn't, and we shouldn't be following it, even if it did work. Instead, we want to be who we are and be it well. And to my mind, that means rooting our response in our Catholic faith, and in particular, how we sort of craft our responses. So a couple of things. First, as I've said again and again, our faith calls us to hold the weakest and most vulnerable close and to work together with them as much as possible. When it comes to the abuse crisis, that means victim survivors, and they should be at the heart of any response. And a corollary to that is that we should avoid diminishing or distracting from their pain, from their suffering, by trying to minimize the church's role in the crisis, by saying things like, well, other organizations do this. Look at the Boy Scouts, look at, various sports organizations. I think that we're instead, we need to talk about, that's deflection, and that's not, we are a church called to a greater, we're the Church of Jesus Christ. We're called to act well. This kind of awful evil, this crime, this sin, should not be at the heart of what is happening in our church. And we are different than those other organizations, and we should know it, and not try to diminish our responsibility here by pointing out the failures of others. Secondly, I think that it's important to root our approach in humility and sorrow and repentance. I see so many good examples of this around the country from various leaders. And I think the important thing to remember is that obviously has to be authentic and true. That kind of humility can't be a show for a day. It has to be something that is felt and is a real conversion of heart. And that comes from, again, the involvement of victim survivors and others who have been involved in this for a long time. And finally, I think maximal honesty and truthfulness, again, very difficult sometimes, but very, very important if we're to regain any kind of credibility. In terms of communications from bishops, from clerics, from leaders, I think it's also important to make sure that as those are crafted, that they're pastoral, that they're not, you don't sound like a defense attorney, or you don't sound like you're with the insurance company. We're not risk managers. Bishops are not risk managers, and they're not lawyers. They're pastors, and their language should always make it clear that that's who they are. They should not be charged with using the kind of defensive language that lawyers often include. And I'm a lawyer by background. I mean, I know exactly where that comes from, and I know that a lot of times it's there are many sort of important strategic reasons to do that. Better to not have a communication than to have one that talks in legal obfuscatory language. I very strongly believe that. Our bishops are pastors, our leaders are pastors. As for us, as for communications professionals, when we talk about rooting our principles of effective communication in the church, I think that we remember that this is a vocation, and we're called to act with professional excellence here. And so that means, and that means that we follow the sort of basic rules, best practices of communications. And this isn't the time to go through all of those, except to say that our communications on this and everything else should be proactive, they should be positive, they should be consistent and coordinated, and they should be action-oriented. Very important for us to be as professionally, to live up to our professional obligations as we can. And then finally, we resist division and polarization. As I talked about before, remember that we're all in this together, and these communications should be sure to show mercy to others and not look for opportunities to pick on others, to call out their faults, but so much to look at our own faults and how we can change. So finally, just to wrap up, I want to talk about, how, again, we've tried to talk about how we move from anger and anguish from this crisis of credibility to something that's closer to a path forward. I have no illusions that this is sort of a project that will be done in a year or 2 years. This is going to be a matter of decades. And we need to bring our professional best practices to that. But that professional best practices, those professional responsibilities need to be rooted in the gospel, need to be rooted in service to the least of these, need to be rooted in honesty and transparency, and most of all, the beating heart of the gospel, remembering that we're here not sort of one versus another, but all together, not solitary pilgrims. So with that, maybe I'll turn it over to questions, Mike. I'm not sure if anybody has any or if we're ready for it, but that's where I come from on this. I think it's been a remarkable year in many ways, just an incredibly challenging one. But I mean, to the extent it's challenging for us as communicators, obviously that's so small compared to the challenges faced by so many people for so long, as the church tries to take small steps towards changing here. So thank you very much for having me. Mike, do you have any questions or anything?
Yeah, well, again, encourage people to use the form on the side where they can submit questions, and as those are coming in, I have a couple of questions, so we can get started with those. We talked about kind of like the importance of reforming clerical culture. Most folks on the call today are lay people. Most are women. So who, again, we work in collaboration with priests, but in some very fundamental ways just don't have access to power. It's the same sort of power as has often now been kind of tied up with ordination. So as someone, yourself, who've been in Catholic world for a long time in a lot of different contexts, how do you live into that? How do you collaborate with folks who are ordained? How do you face kind of what you have to face, knowing that we don't have, again, the same ability necessarily to change things as people who are ordained do?
That's a great question, and I want to first talk about women in the church. It is so important to get more women in decision-making roles and more women in conversations about this issue in particular. In the meetings that I was in Rome, there were about, let's say there were anywhere between 12 and 15 of us around a table. 4 of us were women. And of the 4, 2 spoke English, 2 spoke only Italian. And it was amazing to me how many times we'd be, in a conversation in whatever language with our translators and whatever, and something would be said, and all the women around the room would lock eyes. Like we all got it, right? We all, whatever the conversation is about, we got it. We shared a perspective, and we could see that many others in the room did not. And it was just this very telling moment. And we also what we brought to the conversation at times when there were more of us in the room, the conversation was different. We all just know this from the way we live our professional lives, from our outside lives. I mean, women need to be in these conversations. Mothers need to be in these conversations. So to my mind, one thing we can do is really make sure that we work hard to get, without any issues of ordination or the diaconate or anything else. I mean, those issues are important, in other lanes. And I think those are longer, whatever your views on those issues, to my mind, I want to bracket those in terms of this conversation because there's just so much room for women's involvement in the church. So many women who do so much good work in chanceries and dioceses and other places, but also just so much room to be a part of these conversations. And so you ask, how do we do that, right? I think, and I take this as a responsibility on me and on any other woman who's in these conversations. I'm sure many people on the call are in conversations at wherever they sit in the church. And I think it's a real responsibility to advocate for this more vocally than we've been doing. I take that as a responsibility on myself to constantly ask, why isn't there another, why can't we bring in this person? Why can't we have this woman at the table? A good example, and I'll stop. This is obviously a hobby horse of mine, so I won't go on forever. But at this February meeting, we had the most powerful speakers by everyone's sort of universal agreement there were the 3 women who spoke. One each of the subsequent days that we had it. And obviously it should have been more than 3 of the 9 slots. But these 3 women were just incredible and gave powerful remarks. And one of the reasons, besides the substance of what they said, one of the reasons they were so powerful was because their voice was so unusual to this audience. It's just time to raise that voice. And so for the conversation about lay people more generally, I think it's a similar point. It's time for us to advocate more vocally. That's happening at places like Leadership Roundtable, Catholic Partnership Summit. Certainly many bishops are on board with that, but we need to keep the pressure on.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions in. One from Kelly. How do you manage expectations of a boss or an editor who doesn't agree with some of the tenets that you've put forth, Kim? And do you have any talking points or advice to share with collaborating?
Yeah, managing expectations is very key. Sometimes, if you were following this run up to the February meeting closely, it often felt to me like people kept saying, kept literally saying the words, "I'm lowering expectations." Pope Francis would say, "Don't have great expectations," or other people surrounding the meeting might use that exact phrase. And it was very difficult in some ways, and at the same time, very important to set the tone. That a short meeting could not achieve sort of a grand result of solving this horrible tragedy and crisis in the church. But so how the particular question is, how do you manage expectations with your boss? I am always very clear, or I try to be very clear about, I make a recommendation and I kind of try to game out, here's what I see happening if this recommendation is followed. Here's what I see happening if not. And it's a matter of honesty on our part as communications professionals. That also takes a little bit of courage. I think that, but they're due our candor. That's what we owe. That's what we are supposed to bring as a best practice. And so it's very important to be candid, to understand as a professional when your advice isn't taken, but to be candid and very thorough at the outset with what you can expect and what you can expect from various kinds of response strategies, I would say. And in terms of talking points or what have you, I don't really like to use that phrase so much, but I like to think about themes that people can talk through. And I want to encourage everybody to go to for the February meeting. There was a great website. It's terrible. Let's say the link. It's pbc2019, I think .org. But anyway, it collects a lot of materials there, and I think that's a good resource for people trying to think about how to talk about this.
Sure. We have one question from John, kind of about some of the specifics of language. One phrase we've seen a lot is credibly accused.
Yeah.
And wondering, in kind of canon law and their charter using that term, and maybe their description of what they think that means is as it could have happened. And when a lot of civil law maybe would employ the phrase to mean evidence exists that a crime occurred. I think we sometimes, there has been some now attention paid in recent kind of news reports about what that phrase credibly accused means. So just even navigating some of that nuance.
Yeah. So first of all, that's a great question. I think one of the best treatments of this issue, sort of in a popular way, is Chris White wrote an article at Crux, kind of walking through the various ways people talk about the phrase credibly accused. I do think your description of it is accurate, that popularly people think about it as, we like to use it as, sort of it could have happened. People were physically in this location. Nobody was out of the country. Nobody was, unable for this to happen. How do you manage those kinds of legal, distinctions, right? There's all sorts of standards and it differs all over. I think it's mostly important to be very clear in the kind of materials you're producing to support your communications, what the definitions are and what standards you're operating under. So to the extent you're releasing names, for instance, and again, I default to as much honesty and candor and transparency as possible. But to the extent you're releasing them, to give as much information as you can, and to define your terms in some way in the document that's clear so that people know the standard you're working from. But again, if you're working with a bishop or you're working with a leader of an order or what have you, some other kind of leader who's communicating, I don't think it's effective for them to be the ones to communicating on issues like this. What does the standard mean or what have you? I think I'd find that in supporting materials in some way.
Sure. Just one question, I wrestle with in my work is, so you talked about the importance of kind of acknowledging and putting the victim survivors front and center while also kind of telling kind of positive stories. And so trying to do both of those things, like honoring and, kind of sitting in that pain and acknowledging it while also telling stories of great stuff that's happening, in my case, across the Jesuit world. So how do you kind of do both of those things?
This is not a great stuff happening. I think your point is, in the abuse crisis, we're talking about something very serious. And what about these other great stories that we have? I want to be clear about that. I don't think when we talk about the abuse crisis, whether it's here at the initiative or in other situations, it's not a lot of telling great stories or this is a success. I think it's very sober reporting on what's happening. So we can say that the February meeting, for instance, had some concrete results from it regarding standards around what counts as pornography, regarding the Vatican city-state guidelines, regarding task forces. We can report that without kind of pretending that this is some, great solution to the crisis, or that we don't have a long, long way to go. And so within this lane of the abuse crisis, I think that it's important to not try to happy talk it or anything. In terms of how do we talk about the other great work that our various institutions are doing, I think, again, at this moment in time, it's important to be very sober about how we talk about that, and not celebratory in a way that I think we start from a position of humility. We start from a position of soberness and quiet witness. And that's a prudential judgment, a matter of tone. It's very important to hold up that witness, though. I mean, it's very important for people to know that despite this great crisis, despite this awfulness that we've had in the church, and then continue to have, that thousands of homeless people will have shelter tonight because of the church. And that, around the country, there will be, how many million people will worship? How many million people, or how many, tens of thousands of people will have food to eat because of the Catholic Church, or refugees will be welcomed, or what have you. Those stories are important to tell, but I think that the manner in which they're told should certainly not be triumphalistic in any way.
Sure.
So.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kim, for joining us. Again, we have recorded this, and we'll send a link out. As you were talking, kind of describing the importance of us to root this work in our faith, I just kept thinking about Jean Vanier, who we just lost yesterday. Such, I think, a powerful example of accompaniment, someone who, again, spent his life in ministry in relationship with those with disabilities, and living really on the margins and kind of putting them at the center. And just such a great model for us in all that we do, and that kind of reorientation,
I'm so glad you said that. Can I just jump in with one thing? I am just such a huge admirer of Jean Vanier, and one of the things that I'm looking at my bulletin board over here, and it's stuck up on it, among many other reminders from his work, is that we're not called to be, but it's so important, and it's so important for this work, that we're not called to achieve a solution, but we're called to be a sign. And I think that that's important, that our witness, our work, we're called to be a sign here. So even though our solutions we're not going to arrive at a solution, it's important for us to make this effort rooted in our gospel mission. Thank you for bringing him up.
Yeah, no, certainly. We do have a couple more minutes, and as we were just chatting there, we had another question that came in specifically about kind of facing the crisis within a school's context. So I don't know, Kim, if you have any experience kind of within that context to how you imagine response might.
I don't have any personal experience with it, although I've seen it handled well and poorly. And I think that I'm sure there are many people on this call who could offer really strong advice on that. My general disposition on that, as a parent with kids in Catholic schools from college down to elementary school right now, is that, obviously it's appropriate to the context of your school, and at the same time, lots of listening and lots of honesty, and just sort of more communication rather than less, directed towards the parents, and honesty about what's happened. I just can't say that enough.
Great. Well, thank you. And we can continue the conversation. We do have everyone's email address gathered, and so we'll follow up again with a link, and feel free again to be in touch with us, and we can connect different people if you're interested in learning more and following up. I did in the chat box here post a few of the links that Kim had mentioned, and we can make sure those are sent as well in the follow-up email, so you can access those resources. But again, thank you to everyone for joining us, and thank you so much, Kim, for taking some time with us today.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it.
All right.
Bye-bye.